In tonight's Wiggins lecture, you're going to be hearing more about one of the writers that was discussed in the film. Phyllis Wheatley was only about 7 years old when she stepped off of a slave ship in Boston Harbor in 1761. She rose from enslavement to a wealthy family in Boston to earn international celebrity, only to die in obscurity and poverty. As the first person of African descent and the second woman in America to publish a book, Wheatley wrote remarkable contributions on topics ranging from religion to politics, some of which are on display in the case in the back of the room. Wheatley is now widely recognized as the mother of African American literature. Despite her contemporaneous fame and subsequent reputation, the many mysteries surrounding her life, a biography of her seemingly impossible until 250 years after she left Africa. Our speaker tonight, Vincent Carretta, is going to talk to us about the experience of writing that seemingly impossible book. Professor Carretta teaches English at the University of Maryland in College Park, where he specializes in 18th century transatlantic historical and literary studies. He's held fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the John Carter Brown Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the University of London, and the W.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. Author of more than 100 articles and reviews, Vin has also written and edited 11 books, most recently Equiano, The African, Biography of a Self-Made Man, 2005, The Life and Letters of Philip Quaque, the first African Anglican missionary, 2010, and what he's going to be talking about tonight, Phyllis Wheatley, Biography of a Genius in Bondage, published last year. I'm delighted to welcome him to Antiquarian Hall this evening.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for coming. Before I start talking, I want to ask a couple of questions of you. How many of you consider yourselves familiar with the life of Phyllis Wheatley? How many of you have read at least 5 poems by Phyllis Wheatley? Okay, so for most of you I can make things up. Phyllis Wheatley is known to us today because she wrote 57 poems, or we have 57 poems that she wrote, 46 of which were published during her lifetime. 38 of those were produced in poems on various subjects, religious and moral, which was published in London in 1773. Besides her poems, we have 4 subscription proposals for books. Only one of those books, her first book, ever appeared. And we have 22 letters. If you do a Google search of Phyllis Wheatley, as I did yesterday, you come up with over 500,000 hits. So she's clearly established herself as an icon of American and African American literature, and increasingly of African British literature as well. We tend to forget that she lived all the last year of her life technically as a subject of George III, since the United States didn't officially come to be until 1783. And her dates are about 1753 to 1784. She died when she was only 31 years old. In November 2005, a 174-word letter that Phyllis Wheatley sent to a fellow black woman servant in 1776, sold for $253,000, more than double what the auction house thought it would fetch. And so, at over $1,400 a word, she clearly has cultural capital in the literary and the material sense. And yet, until last year, no one had published a biography. 250 years since she had arrived in Boston. And it's understandable why I think no one had tried. Many people told me I was foolish to attempt to do so, including the director of research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. When I went there and he asked me, do you really think you're going to be able to write a biography of Phyllis Wheatley? And I said, well, you offered me money. So we'll see what I come up with. we had was of someone who was relatively passive. Things happened to Phyllis Wheatley. She was not usually depicted as someone who was particularly assertive, and I was always curious as to whether that was true. Anyone who writes a biography faces certain challenges. You're certain to be faced with gaps in someone's life. Unless you're fortunate enough to write the life of someone who is writing his or her own autobiography up until the moment that he or she dies, and can sign off, and I died, you have to fill in gaps. Even if you had such an autobiography, you can't trust it, because no one writes under oath. Think about how you describe yourselves. You embellish, you suppress. And so we have the biographers faced with putting together a puzzle, parts of which are missing. And you have to decide what you can speculate about, how far you can speculate. You have to earn your right to speculate. The reader has to grant you the authority to speculate. You also have to decide how to deal with the context when you're writing about a historical figure. How much should one say about the slave trade, for example, when you're dealing with someone like Phyllis Wheatley? How much about slavery in Boston, Boston society, the American Revolution that she lived through, the post-war, post-revolutionary war economic crisis? How do you deal with all of those without burying your subject under the context? How do you deal with the afterlife, if I call it a literary figure? In other words, her reputation after she's died. How do you deal with modern literary critics? Nothing will make a biography more indigestible than a heavy lump of literary criticism, say in a chapter or even spread through. And yet, we're interested in her, at least initially, because of what she wrote. I'll try to convince you that we should also be interested in her because of who she was. But you're faced with the problem of whether to write a critical biography or biographical criticism. Should you try to read her life out of her works, which would assume that she's a fairly naive author who writes transparently? Or should you try to read her works against her biography? And I tried to do the latter. Now, the challenge of writing about Phyllis Wheatley specifically is pretty great, because trying to reconstruct the life of any early modern married woman is difficult, because as soon as a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed under that of her husband. And so you have to be able to track her husband often to be able to find out where she was, what she was doing. This becomes even more the case when you have someone who's an enslaved woman. People of African descent were not always identified as such, especially in New England, where both enslaved people and free people in domestic service were referred to as servants. Sometimes the only evidence you have is if you find someone mentioned in the will as having been willed to someone else. And in Wheatley's case, we have some very questionably reliable sources. Many people, well, we all have to depend on Margaretta Matilda Odell's memoirs and poems of Phyllis Wheatley, which includes a fairly short biography of Phyllis Wheatley that was published in 1834. And Odell clearly seems to have an agenda that in part pushes us towards believing that Phyllis's life was more secure when she was a slave than when she became free, and that Phyllis married an absolute bounder, as we used to say, John Phillips, who in Odell's description comes across as a kind of 18th century version of a snidely whiplash from the 19th century. The other main source we have was published 30 years later by Nathaniel Shurtleff, who did some hardcore archival research. And he found a number of things that are reliable when we check them, but his piece was only about 10 pages long. And he was mainly interested in John Peters, the husband that I'll talk about soon. And then in 1984, William Robinson published a short biographical introduction to an edition of her poetry, in which Robinson found a number of things. He didn't believe in footnotes, so it makes it very difficult to, time-consuming to verify or falsify what he found. Now, I understand the Wiggins lecture often involves some discussion of methodology, so I'll talk a little about or at least identify my methodological guide, the person I follow, someone that you all heard of, someone though that probably those of you who teach methodological courses in methodology may not teach. His name is Ronald Reagan. Trust but verify. And it's actually a useful dictum to try to follow if you're writing biography or any kind of historical research. Well, let me briefly give you Phyllis's life. She was born around 1753, somewhere on the west coast of Africa. We're told by many people that she was born in Senegal or Gambia, or Senegambia as it was called in the 18th century. And this is because we have a couple of extraordinary letters in the Medford Historical Society from the owner of the slave ship that went to Africa to the captain of the slave ship that went to Africa that brought Phyllis back. It's extraordinary because we have extremely few, actually it's the only one that I know, cases in which we can identify the specific ship that brought a specific individual in the 18th century to North America. And since the owner says to the captain, writes to him, go first to Senegambia, and people pretty much stopped reading there, it seems. Senegal issued a stamp commemorating Phyllis Wheatley, for example. But if you read further in the letter, you discover that the owner says to him, stay only a few days. That's in part because Britain was at war with France at the time. Stay only a few days. Do not buy any little girls. You bought those little girls the last time, the last trip, and you can't sell them. And he says, go down the coast and buy young men and boys. And so Phyllis Wheatley would have been about the last piece of human cargo that the slave captain would have bought. So and the captain was off the coast of Africa for several months. So he would have bought her much farther down the African coast. But she arrived on 11 July 1761 in Boston. She was bought by Susanna and John Wheatley. John Wheatley was a tailor, among other things, but he was also a merchant in a transatlantic business with London. And Susanna Wheatley was a devout Congregationalist who had links to English Congregationalists and to other English evangelicals, particularly the Countess of Huntingdon. As the Wheatleys named Phyllis, gave her a first name after the slave ship, which was named Phyllis, that had brought her from Africa. And one of the things I found intriguing is the fact that Phyllis was about 7 years old. We know this because she was missing her front teeth. And she was about exactly the same age as a daughter that the Wheatleys had who died in 1752, just about when Phyllis Wheatley was born. And that daughter had died when she was 7 years old. So the Wheatleys may have bought Phyllis as a kind of substitute for the dead daughter. Certainly, the extraordinary way that they educated Phyllis would suggest that she was given very special treatment by them. The Wheatleys, John and Susanna Wheatley, were members of the New South Congregationalist Church in Boston. Phyllis Wheatley made such progress in learning the English language that she published her first poem in 1767, only 6 years after she arrived. And in October of 1770, she published an elegy on the death of the Methodist evangelical preacher George Whitefield, who died in Massachusetts on his 7th trip to a missionary trip to North America. And she sent a copy of this poem to the Countess of Huntingdon in England, who was Whitefield's patron. In 1771, Phyllis was baptized, as was conventional for the congregations, at about the age of 18, in the Old South Congregationalist Church in Boston, not the church of her owners, which may have been her first act of independence. By 1772, February of 72, she had published and written enough poems that the Wheatleys tried to get subscribers for a proposed book of Phyllis's poems. So only 11 years after she had arrived, she's already trying to be a published author of a book. She did not get enough response in America to that book, that proposed book. So the Wheatleys sent a note to the Countess of Huntingdon in England asking for her patronage of the book. And the Countess welcomed the opportunity. Phyllis left for England to meet the Countess in May of 1773. She arrived in June, and she left in July. So it was only about a 6-week trip. The book was published in September, just after Wheatley had left, so she was not there when the book was actually published. But it made her the first person of African descent and only the second woman in America to publish a book. And it gave her international celebrity. By October of 1773, she was free. We know this because of a letter that she wrote to David Wooster in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm going to talk more about that letter. It's an extremely significant letter. Once she was free, her writings show a distinctly stronger opposition to slavery than her writings before she was free. Not surprisingly, I think. And, for example, an extract of a letter that she wrote to the Native American minister Samson Occam was published first in February 1774 in the Connecticut Gazette, in which she attacks slavery very directly and talks about the new pharaohs of slave owners. And this letter was reproduced throughout the colonies many times, including by Isaiah Thomas, your man, in his Massachusetts Spy. By 1778, she was well known to a number of other authors of African descent, two of whom, Ignatius Sancho and Jupiter Hammond, mention her. Ignatius Sancho was an African-British author, and Jupiter Hammond was an African-American author. Neither of them ever met Phyllis Wheatley. On the 1st of April, 1778, just a month after John Wheatley died, Susanna Wheatley had died in 1774, but just after John Wheatley died, Phyllis Wheatley and John Peters announced their engagement. And in October 1779, Phyllis Wheatley Peters advertised for subscribers to a proposed second volume of her poetry, and this time letters, that would be dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. This volume never appeared. As far as we know, Benjamin Franklin did not know that she was going to be dedicated to. She proposed that second volume again in September of 1784. Again, got no response. Of course, part of the reason is probably the fact that the American, well, now the new United States, was in an economic depression, so it was very difficult to sell books. And she died on 5 December 1784. As I said before, she was about 31 years old. And John Peters, according to Odell, quotes, "went south." That's heartbreaking to a biographer. There's a lot south of Boston. So John Peters has always been one of the great mysteries of Phyllis Wheatley's life, and I'm sure one of the reasons people did not want to try to write a biography of her. There are significant gaps in her life, and some of those I've tried to fill, and some of those I've succeeded in filling. I've already mentioned the claim that she was born in the Senegambia area. Another question that comes up with her is her education. She had obviously an extraordinary education. I decided I should try to norm that if I could. And fortunately, there is a diary by a white contemporary girl, Phyllis's age, who actually went to the same church with Phyllis, Anna Green Winslow. And she talks about the books that she was reading. And what she was reading were what we would call children's versions of adult books. A children's version of Gulliver's Travels, a children's version of Pamela, children's versions of other 18th century novels. Phyllis, on the other hand, was reading Alexander Pope's translation of Homer. She was reading the adult books. She was not, and we know this because of allusions in her poetry, of comments in her letters, and comments by other people. The other person I compared her to, the other contemporaneous girl I compared her to, was Chloe Spear, another slave. And Chloe Spear had to try to sneak education against the will of her masters. And she never achieved a high enough level of literacy to be able to write her own autobiography. Hers is an early, as told to tale, as we say. That is, it was transcribed by a white amanuensis. I also discovered a new poem by Phyllis. When I was looking for weather, I decided something of a ferret when it comes to doing research, I suppose. And I decided I should try to find out what the weather was like on every day that we know of, specific day we know of Phyllis's life, and the way people kept weather records were in almanacs. And Jeremy Belknap, who was one of the founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, in his almanac for 1765, he mentions and he transcribes a poem by Phyllis Wheatley, which makes it the earliest known work by her. It's not a great poem by any means, but she was only in an English-speaking environment for 4 years at that time. And I want to come back now to, I'm going to jump to the middle period of her life, in a 31-year life, year-long life. The early period, the middle period, the late period, pretty short each. And this is the letter to David Wooster that I mentioned before, in October of 1773, when she'd just been free for at most a month. She writes to him, and she tells him about her time in London, who she saw, what she did. She was treated like a visiting celebrity or a freak, depending on how you want to, what angle you want to take on the way people treated her. But she says that she went to the British Museum. She says that she met Benjamin Franklin. She met Granville Sharp. And many Americanists, people who work in American literature, are all excited by the fact that she says she met Benjamin Franklin. And in this letter, when she first mentions being free, they say, well, Franklin had something to do with it. Well, Franklin had a slave with him in London. He wasn't big on freeing slaves in 1773. His abolitionist urges came much later. But the person who really mattered to me was Granville Sharp, because Granville Sharp, the year before, had finally succeeded after several years of trying to get the King's Bench Court to rule that no slave brought to England from the colonies could legally be forced back to the colonies. A major ruling from any slave's point of view. And in the letter, Phyllis says that it was Granville Sharp who took her as in fact, her tour guide to the British Museum, the Tower of London. The odds that Granville Sharp, who had spent years trying to win the case that he won the year before, exactly a year before, would not, the subject of self-emancipation for the most famous enslaved person in the British Empire, not to come up, especially when they're looking at, the Tower of London had a small zoo, and they had 2 wolves, one of which was named Phyllis. I told you it was very. And she, in the first 2 paragraphs of this 3-paragraph letter, she uses mainly the passive voice. They did this, they showed me that, things were done for her, people came to visit to meet her, she was taken to meet so-and-so. And there's a series of big names and celebrities in England. But as soon as she turns to the third, at the end of the second paragraph, she says that she was freed at the desire of her friends in England, and that she has left a copy of her freedom papers with one of the British agents for the American colonies. And she says very explicitly, so that there can be no claims against me or my property by my former owners. And then in the last paragraph, she turns to the active voice, and she tells David Wooster, I am getting my books. I'm going to be selling my books. Do not let any printer in New Haven sell copies of my books unless they're the ones that I get from London and that I have signed so you know they're mine. She says, I'm now on my own footing. I need the money. And we suddenly see a very assertive Phyllis Wheatley, who also has a lot of business savvy. I mean, she's signing the books so that people can't sell pirated copies of them as if they were hers. Well, as I said, she married John Peters on April 1st, 1778. All of us who had written on Phyllis Wheatley, including me, I'm confessing to guilt here, had assumed that this was the day they married, and we all talked about this as the day they married. I always felt a little uncomfortable about that because in May of 1778, and again August of being she's writing to people and saying, signing herself as Phyllis Wheatley, not Phyllis Wheatley Peters, and not Phyllis Peters. And in fact, in one letter in May of 1778, she writes to a friend and says, please send an email to me under the cover of John Peters. So she was obviously living with John Peters, I would suspect in what we would call in sin, but at least they were sharing the same roof and they were not married. I was able to discover, with the help of my friend Jeremy, who's sitting over there, at the Massachusetts Historical Society, that they actually married on Thanksgiving Day in 1778, a very snowy, cold day, for those of you who worry about such things. And who was this John Peters, this great mystery man? Was he the snidely whiplash of Odell's account? Was he someone who practiced law and passed himself off as a physician, as Shurtleff says? Was he a failure, as Odell says? Did he and Phyllis have children? And what happened to him? Did he go south? Well, fortunately for the biographer, John Peters had lots of legal problems on both the giving and the receiving ends. And so I've spent a lot of time with what are called taking books, what we would call property assessments, court records, including records here at the AAS and the Massachusetts Court of Common Pleas, and jail records and census records. Now, I decided that I'd have to ignore Odell's Go South because I couldn't do anything with that. It was just too much. And I also had to try to figure out a way to fill in the big gap of 1780 to 1784. Suddenly, Phyllis goes silent, and we hear nothing of Phyllis or John Peters during that period. Now, Phyllis was not completely out of the public eye. For example, in a woodcut reproduction of the frontispiece portrait that your man Isaiah Thomas produced in Bickerstaff's Boston Almanac for 1782, which is the case back there, he reproduced her image. So her image is still before the public. But to fill in a gap, well, 4 years, I had to make a negative evidence argument, which is always a dangerous argument to make because you have to pray that you've looked at everything that can be looked at before you go to the negative evidence. And by negative evidence, I mean an argument that accounts for the absence of evidence. And I think I've made that case because John Peters, who first appears in records in 1776 as a shopkeeper in one of many people suing a loyalist who had fled to England, a loyalist named Joseph Scott. And they unsuccessfully sued him, of course, because he fled, so they couldn't collect from him. And John Peters is the only name on that long list of men who is not identified as Mr. So I figured, okay, he's probably my John Peters, but I have to keep looking. Well, my John Peters in 1779 was suing a business partner who, with whom he was selling goods in western Massachusetts. And he won this case in 1780. Unfortunately for him, and at this time he was doing pretty well because in taking books he's worth $150 pounds, colonial pounds, which was a fair amount of money. In October of 1779, Phyllis advertises for the second volume. using only the name Phyllis Peters. She doesn't mention her name Wheatley, which is a bad advertising move, so it probably suggests that her husband was the one who was really promoting it. But all things seem to be going very well for him, except that he was being sued by someone else, a Susanna Sheaf, who was a wholesaler in Boston, who was probably the person who had sold him and his business partner the goods that they retailed. And she won a huge settlement, which was more than he was worth in property, plus what he had won in his suit. Fortunately, since he won his suit, his winnings included his costs, and his costs included his travel. And for the first couple of sessions, and the court met quarterly, there is no travel allowance, so he was living in Boston. But once he's being sued by Susanna Sheaf, he starts having 30 miles of travel allowance given him. So he's living 15 miles outside of Boston. And once he loses the suit, he in effect goes underground. You hear nothing of him. And so I think in the 18th century, the way you avoided, well, if you were hit with debt, you either hid in your house and didn't come out so you could be arrested. You got arrested and went to debtor's prison, and debtor's jail. There wasn't a separate prison at the time for debtors. And you would wait until your creditor either gave up or figured, well, maybe if you get out, you'll make enough money to hit you again. Or you flee. And I think what he did is he fled, because in 1784 he pops up again after the war, and he applies for what we would call a liquor license, which he's granted. And unfortunately, Susanna Sheaf was still in Boston. He is almost immediately arrested, because in September, the taking book, the tax record book, lists him as taken on the 1st of September, 1784, John Peters, Negro. And he's in jail. While he's in jail, Phyllis Wheatley issues a final proposal for the second volume, which is not taken up. But it demonstrates that she's showing agency, activity, assertiveness, while her husband is incapacitated. The charge that he abandoned Phyllis, which is a charge that Odell makes and many other people have picked up, seems a bit unfair to John Peters, because he was almost certainly in jail for debt when she died in December. He's certainly in jail in February, early in 1785. And the records are not records of how long someone was in jail. They're like attendance records. It's what if the person was in jail on the day the record was taken. We have no birth, baptismal, or death records of any children of Phyllis, even though Odell tells us that they had 3 children, all of them predeceased Phyllis. Well, let me just quickly kill off John Peters for you. For the next 5 years, he's in and out of debtor's prison. And when he's out, he's suing other people. So we have all of these legal records of him. He finally gets back on his feet around 1790, when we have him worth $25 and identified as a black man, Dr. Pinto. And I'll explain that. And my favorite one is the following year, he's identified as worth in real estate $25 and he's identified as lawyer, physician, gentleman, Pintlesmith. Now, in case someone doesn't know what a Pintlesmith is, a pintle is the pin on which something turns, like a rudder or a door hinge. Gentleman, to claim that almost had the status of gentleman was rather cheeky. This is probably part of what upset Odell, because she claims that he took on airs. Lawyer, physician, we need to keep in mind that there was no law school in the colonies at this time. And there are medical schools in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, but certainly not open to a person of African descent. And most people who practice medicine were actually clergy in the colonial period. So this is not extraordinary. The fact that he has multiple occupations that he claims, again, is pretty normal. Most people tried as many things as they could because, and especially in the post-war period where people were going bankrupt all the time. And so he continues suing people until in 1793, he's actually indicted for being a common barrator. Barratry is the big word for litigious. It was a page in the legal book. And the charge against him was discharged the following February, and after which he's not in court suing or being sued. So he learned his lesson. By 1798, he's worth $200 in real estate, so he's really gone up. And in 1799, he's listed as John Peters, gone to Cambridge, $200 real estate, Dr. Pintelmender. And then in 1800, he's listed as John Peters, black man, dead, 200 real estate. I, ferret-like as I can be, felt uncomfortable with the idea that he went to Cambridge, went north, not south, and then died in Boston the following year. So I just kept digging and discovered that in Charlestown, which probably most of you know is a little north of Boston, you find the death notice of Dr. John Peters, age 55, which meant he was born around 1746. But was it by John Peters? Fortunately, he died as he lived, more in debt than in property, and he died intestate, so there had to be an administration. And the administration reads, of John Peters, late of Charlestown, Negro and physician. So he's my man. Among his possessions were 2 small mahogany tables, one of which may be the small mahogany writing table that the Massachusetts Historical Society is so proud of. And so now that I've killed him off, we'll just quickly turn back to Phyllis. Phyllis's life seemed to demonstrate at the end that Ignatius Sancho was very prophetic in 1778, when, although he had never met her, he writes, referring to the white people, especially the owners, these good, great folks all know and perhaps admire, nay, praise genius in bondage, and then, like the priests and Levites in sacred writ, pass by, not one good Samaritan amongst them. That is a fair description of the lonely death she seemed to have. But she has achieved the prophecy offered a few years later by the pseudonymous Matilda in the New York Magazine. This is 1796, and I'll end with this. A Phyllis rises in the world no more, denies a sacred right to mental power, while heaven-inspired she proves her country's claim to freedom in her own